Welcome to Let's Talk Automotive, and in this week's segment on how things work, we are going to be talking air suspensions, and specifically I'm going to show you how air bellows work on an air suspension system. So where do we find air suspensions typically? Well, first of all, a lot of really luxurious upper end vehicles may come standard with air suspensions. But you may also have seen air suspensions in action on some heavy commercial vehicles, especially on the trailers. And sometimes when you're driving behind those trailers, you might have seen these two very big black air bags, as they're called, and that is the air suspension system on trucks. All right, so how does an air suspension work? Well, in its basic form, what we do is we actually replace a steel spring. Whether it's a coil spring or whether it's a leaf spring, we replace those springs, those steel springs, with air bags. And that air bag becomes the spring. So how does that work? Well, essentially what we're doing is that we're taking the same principles as a tire, which is also made out of rubber. A tire gives us some sort of spring rate. And an airbag is no different. So we pump that airbag with a certain volume of air, and the resistance of that air compressing gives us our spring effect. Now, you would have seen on premium cars, for example, that you have preset settings that you can press, because we've got a few things that we can do with air suspension. The first thing that we can do is we can change the ride height of the vehicle according to how much air we pump into the bellow. The second thing that we can do is that the amount of air pressure that we put into the bellow might also stiffen up the suspension a little bit for us. So as I said, on the premium cars, you have preset buttons that you can press, and it'll either give us a sporty suspension setting or a different ride height on the suspension setting. Similarly, if we put a trailer or something heavy on the rear of the vehicle, that air suspension is going to auto level the vehicle by pumping more air into the air bellows. Now, the good news is that you don't have to necessarily purchase a very expensive premium vehicle to enjoy the benefits of air suspension. There are some brilliant aftermarket kits that are easily available, even in South Africa, that you can purchase and retrofit to your vehicle. So we're going to show you pictures now, for example, of what we can do with a bucky, where we can remove a leaf spring just to soften up the suspension, and we then place a rubber air bellow between the spring and the axle itself and the chassis, and that then becomes our air suspension. With the aftermarket kits, we can also get quite sophisticated in terms of having things like cab controls in the bucky, a compressor that will pump up the air bellows, and in fact we can even have an accumulator, which is a tank that stores air under high pressure so that we can have air on demand as we press a button in the cab. Or we can make it very simple and just have the air bellows by themselves with an air line that goes up towards, for example, the fuel filler cap, and if we want to pump up air into the air bellows, we simply go to the garage and we use the same compressor hose that we would pump our tires with to pump up our air bellows, and if we want to release air out of it, we simply hold down the nozzle and let the air out. So what are the advantages of air suspension per se? Well, there's quite a few. The first is that air bellows actually isolate vibrations much more efficiently than steel springs. And there's a few advantages with that alone. The first is that there's less vibration harshness that comes through to the cabin. So as occupants, it's much quieter for us and much more comfortable. We are literally driving on air. The second thing is that because it is efficient at reducing vibration harshness, all the components within our suspension, so our bushes, the suspension components themselves, our bodywork, and in fact items on the vehicle itself will last longer as a result of not having the same level of vibrations that are translating through to all those systems. And that also talks to items that we might be transporting. So for example, if we're transporting sensitive computer goods, hard drives and the like, or even food for that matter, air suspension will look after everything that is on board. And that is why, for example, and let's just put it out there for Woolworths. Woolworths uses a company called Fast and Fresh to transport all their goods. And those vehicles have to have air suspension fitted to them. So it's no coincidence that that crisp lettuce that you find at Woolworths is in fact crisp. It's because it's been transported very carefully on air suspension. So those are some of the advantages that we have from air suspension. But of course, there's always good with bad. And there are some negatives of air suspension. And one of the things that we've got to get to grips with is that air suspension, because it's predominantly made out of air bellows, is a wear and tear item. And it is subject to fail and it is subject to wear. And we've got to get used to the fact that just like we have to replace tires on our vehicles, we're going to at some point have to replace those hard-working air bellows. Now, typical failures that can occur either with the air bellows or the suspension itself include the air bellows suffer from dry rot. They're made out of rubber and unfortunately they do crack and therefore create leaks as a result. Air bellows also don't like moisture, so that's why we have dehumidifiers as part of the circuit of airflow into the air bellow. So if that dehumidifier fails and we get moisture into the air bellow, it also causes problems. Very, very seldom will the air bellow actually tear as a result of a stone getting wedged in it, for example. So it's most likely going to be either dry rot or, in fact, moisture that causes the air bellow to fail. Now, can we do anything to lengthen the lifespan of that? Well, first of all, yes. In fact, one of the things that we can do is use our air bellows. So at least once a week, change the ride height on the vehicle and get that air bellow to work. The second thing that we can do is we can put a water-based silicone onto the air bellow. So the air bellows then will be protected from dry rot as well as moisture. Now, the reason why it works to use the air suspension is because the manufacturers of the air bellows actually embed a form of wax into the rubber. And when that air bellow works, that wax then is raised to the surface of the rubber, and that affords some protection as well. All right, so those are the disadvantages of air suspension, but I've got to say, on the whole, if you have a look at the cost saving that you get by protecting all the other components on your vehicle, plus the ride comfort and the convenience of being able to adjust your suspension height, I personally think that air suspensions are fantastic innovations, and if I could afford it on a vehicle, there's no doubt that that would be one of the specifications that I would apply. Okay, so that's it on air suspensions. I hope you found that information useful and helpful in terms of if you are deciding on whether to buy a vehicle with air suspension or not. And we look forward to seeing you on future episodes of How Things Work.